thanks for coming. Today we're going to have a little different change of pace, some plant stuff again. So I know. Cheers for the back. So today we have Paul Fine join us. He is currently an assistant professor at Berkeley. He works on obviously Amazonian trees. He did his undergrad work at Berkeley in integrated biology. He then moved on to the University of Utah, where he did his PhD work and did a postdoc at University of Michigan. And now he's returned back to his alma mater as a professor, and he's going to be telling us some of his work that he's been doing in the Amazon. So I'm just going to turn it right over to you and let you tell us about.
Great. Well, thanks very much for coming, everybody. It's a pleasure to just come over here to San Francisco. You know, San Francisco is like, what, 10 or 15 miles away from the East Bay, but I love coming over here. It's like I'm on vacation or something. Everything's so different. It's like a real city with a completely different environment, and you guys are really lucky to live here and go to school here. So what I work on is a latitudinal gradient in species diversity. And I don't know how many of you have heard this term before. But what it means is that if you think about almost any group of organisms, whether it's trees or birds or bats, you know, if you measure how many species you find in any given spot and you start moving south down to the equator, you're going to find higher and higher totals, higher and higher species richness. And people have been wondering about this for a long time, and there's still no consensus explanation for why there's so many species in the tropics and comparatively so few in the temperate zone. And ever since I learned about this and visited the tropics, I've been really interested in this question. So, you know, my focus is trees, and just trees are a great example of this pattern. So here in the US and Canada, we have about 600 species of trees. And I can find 600 species of trees just in this photograph. I can't point them all out to you right here, but we don't know how many species of trees are in the Amazon basin. You know, it could be 10,000, 15,000, 16,000. There is actually a paper coming out in probably 2 weeks in the journal Science with about 120 authors. If you look in the middle, you might find my name. We're close enough. And there's a new paper where they looked at about 1,200 different plots across the Amazon basin, and estimating, using this data, that there's 16,000 species in the Amazon. And it turns out most of those species are actually relatively common. They're not really that common, but they're relatively common. And most of the other species, all the 15,800 of them, are super rare. Now, I'm going to take this with a grain of salt because we actually don't know, not even to the nearest 1,000, how many species of trees are in the Amazon, because nobody's working on it. There hasn't been the kind of effort and investment in systematic research and actually getting collections, looking at the biology of these organisms, and figuring out how many species there are. But what I can tell you is there's a lot of species in the Amazon, and there's way more, right? 16,000 compared to 600, that's a really big difference. And this diversity is really apparent at a number of different scales. So if you, like I said in that photograph here, you know, you can probably find, this is in Bolivian Amazon, but I don't know, even just in this shot, there's probably 300 or 400 or 500 species of trees right here, just in this couple square mile area. In the temperate zone here in California, when you're wandering around an area this size, you're going to come up with 25 or 30 species of trees. That's pretty different. And most people have really focused on this question of why are so many tropical species, is trying to figure out how can so many species coexist in one community, in one area? Why don't they, have different niches, or why don't they undergo competitive exclusion, and how do they all survive? How do they all maintain themselves? And so a lot of research has been done on that, and people have studied whether trees have different shade or light requirements, or different microclimate requirements, or different defenses against natural enemies. And fewer people have looked at what about the turnover in species composition? Because if you think about all those 16,000 species, you have how many ever you find in one spot, but then as you walk across the Amazon basin, you're going to find more and more species. And so you can get turnover in species composition just with geographic distance, but you can also get it with different habitat types. If you go to a riverside forest and an upland forest, you might find different species of trees, right? And so that's really been the focus of my research, is trying to figure out why different species of trees live in different kinds of environments. within a pretty large scale. And I got this idea to study this from this guy named Al Gentry. And Al Gentry was one of the most prolific botanists in the 20th century. This guy was a beast. And he spent all his time just wandering around forests collecting plants. He's collected more than 80,000 different plant specimens in his career. And he would go basically to any country he could think of, and he'd set up these, what are known as gentry plots, where he'd just sample 5 100-meter transects, basically, or actually that's not right, but 10, 50-meter transects, and try to figure out all the plants that he could figure out. And he compiled all this information, and he noticed that habitat specialization was really important, and that when he sampled areas that had a number of different habitats, he found lots and lots more species. And so he thought, that might be the key to understanding tropical diversity. But if you think about it, why, the Amazon basin is the place in the world where there's the most tree species in the world at any scale. But why should there be so many habitat specialists in the Amazon basin? If you think about habitats, you often think of topographic heterogeneity, but the Amazon is one of the flattest places in the world. How many people have been in the Amazon? All right. I mean, if you're flying over the Amazon, it looks a little bit like Ohio. It's just like flat anywhere you can see, except for there's tropical rainforest everywhere and big rivers. But there's big rivers in Ohio. And this gets to the question of thinking about what habitat is, for a plant. If your plant, is it just, what the average temperature is, or the minimum, maximum temperature, how much rainfall, or the seasonality of rainfall, what the soil fertility is? Is that what constitutes a habitat for a tree, or maybe disturbance? Or are there biotic factors that influence what a habitat is for a tree? So what about the things that are eating the tree? What about diseases or herbivores? Or what about plants competing with one another? All that biotic environment also impacts what a habitat is. And we know that pests or natural enemies, or you can think about that word, which really means just anything that eats a plant causes the plant to die. Insect herbivores, it could be vertebrate herbivores like sloths, or howler monkeys like to eat plants, and diseases like soil pathogens that attack roots. Probably the most important ones are soil pathogens that attack roots. They kill a lot of seedlings, and insects, things like caterpillar larvae and grasshoppers and beetles. They swarm over young plants, and they eat them, and they kill them, and they die. And so there are more of these enemies, more of these soil pathogens, more of these insect herbivores in the tropical rainforest than in other environments. And so maybe there's something going on where natural enemies might influence what a habitat is to a plant, and that might be especially important in tropical environments. And so there's kind of just a real simple conceptual model that we're using, and that is, if you think about 2 different habitats, one is a low resource habitat and one's a high resource habitat. You can think of it being a high fertility soil and a low fertility soil, or you can think of it being a place with a lot of water availability or really low water availability. Let's say you had 2 kinds of trees growing, one growing at a low resource and one growing at a high resource. This one will grow a lot faster, right? It's got more resources to grow, and it's going to be investing in growth, and this one's going to be trying to grow as fast as it can, but it's got low resources, right? If you throw herbivores onto the system, and they're attacking these plants, the same amount of herbivory, let's say 20% on both, is going to have a much bigger impact on the low resource habitat. And that's because replacing the tissue that's lost to herbivores is going to be a lot more difficult because there's not as many resources here. And so that should drive natural selection for defenses. And so plants that are growing in low resource habitat should invest less in growth and more in defense. And since you can't simultaneously invest in defense and growth at the same time, just like you can't get, you can't invest in rent for your apartment and a flight to Hawaii at the same time, right? Like, your bank's going to call you and say, no, you're not going to Hawaii, right? So that's why, this is what we call a trade-off in ecology. And so there's a defense and growth trade-off. The more you invest in defense, the less you're going to grow, okay? And so the idea is that herbivores can magnify these existing habitat gradients. And this has some implications on a variety of different timescales, like, in sort of, if you just think about how the plants dispersing across the environment and growing in different places, that the herbivores could be preventing high resource species from living in low resource habitats, because the herbivores might eat them first. And the evolutionary timescale, the idea might be, well, over time, over millions of years, plants are going to have strategies that are going to be divergent. In a high resource habitat, they're going to have faster growth and less investment in defense. In a low resource habitat, they may have more defense. And these divergent strategies might decrease the probability of species